In this video, you'll learn about the recommended settings for using software other than Lightroom to optimize images that are being managed by Lightroom. So I'm going to select Lightroom, Preferences, and if you were on a PC, that would be Edit Preferences. And I'll move from the Presets tab over here to External Editing. I have Photoshop CC loaded on this computer, so that will automatically show up here. What you see will depend on what you have on your computer. So these are settings that will be applied when I go from Lightroom into Photoshop CC. Let me just go out of the preferences for a second, show you how that works. Let's just say I'm in Lightroom and I want to edit this in Photoshop CC. Now I may want to add some type, for example. There's things you can do in Photoshop you can't do in Lightroom. So I need to go over to Photoshop, edit there, and then come back to Lightroom. I'm going to right click on the image and choose Edit In here, and then Edit in Adobe Photoshop CC. That will then take me to Photoshop automatically. Now the question is, and that's why we're working on these preferences over here, what is it bringing over to Photoshop? How is this Lightroom file, which is a raw file, how is it being converted so that it can be opened and worked on in Photoshop? And that's where these settings come in. So let's walk through the different options. So under file format, we can bring it in as a TIFF or a PSD. I think they're pretty much the same. You can choose. If you choose TIFF, you will have a compression choice. You can make the file size smaller here under compression. If you choose Photoshop, you won't have that option. Photoshop could be smaller anyway in of itself, but basically the file formats are pretty much the same. Now, as far as color space goes, you have ProPhoto RGB, Adobe RGB, and sRGB. If you're working on an image and you want to maintain as much color detail as possible from Lightroom, which is working in basically a ProPhoto type of color space, this will be your setting. I will caution you, though, that ProPhoto, you should probably know what you're doing before you make this selection. It is absolutely the best selection for people who know what they're doing and understand this very, very wide color space that you get with ProPhoto RGB. If you have any doubts about this, you might want to select Adobe RGB, which is a smaller color space. It'll be more familiar for most people. But the best possible quality would be with ProPhoto RGB. As far as bit depth goes, 16-bit will maintain much more quality than the 8 bits. And this is particularly relevant if you're doing further tonal changes or color changes in Photoshop. You definitely want to stay with the 16 bits. You're making bigger file size, but this is maintaining the quality. Resolution really doesn't matter what you put here because that's something that you set later when you go to print. And as I said, compression is only an option if you've selected TIFF. Okay, so with these settings, now when I go to edit externally in Photoshop, they will be automatically applied. Now, I really want to explain something here because this is when you go straight from Lightroom to Photoshop or an external editor, you can always export your images using the export function of Lightroom, and then you can choose these settings or different settings as well. So you have another chance to export, and then your file just goes out and exists as a file that can be opened separately in Photoshop or any other application. So this is just for the relationship between Lightroom and Photoshop or another external editing tool. Now down here, you can select another external editor. Let's say I don't know, maybe you're using Elements, Photoshop Elements as well. But where I find it a little more useful is that you can actually create a preset that will open your images in, let's say, Photoshop CC using different parameters. So let me show you how that might work. So instead of, well, let's stay with TIFF. We'll keep the TIFF file format, but we'll use sRGB instead of the ProPhoto. sRGB is the kind of the printer color space or monitor color space. So there'll be times when you don't necessarily want to hold the entire ProPhoto color space or the bit depth of 16 bits. So you can go down to sRGB and then 8 bits instead of 6 bits. Resolution, as I said, doesn't really matter here. You can change that later at any time. And you can add compression or not. And once you've done that, you create a new preset, and I'm going to give it a name. I think I'll call this Photoshop CC. I haven't applied a different application, although I can, and I'll call this 8-bit and sRGB, just so I know this is going to be different than the other one. And then create. Right. So now let me go ahead and leave the preferences and right-click on my image in the Develop module. You can see that's an option. So I can either go into Photoshop CC using the 16-bit ProPhoto options, or now bring it down to 8-bit sRGB. So let's go back over to our preferences, open that up. I want to also just emphasize that over here under the application, we can select choose and then find another application to use as an external editor and go that route as well. Down here, stack with original. If you select this, when the image that has been worked on in the external editor comes back into Lightroom, it can be automatically stacked with the original. It's just a way of keeping track of where the copy goes, or not. You can deselect that if you want. And you can also give it a different name. As it is right now, it'll come back with this original file name with edit applied, but you can create a custom name that will be applied when it comes back into Lightroom as well. Okay, so these are your various options when you are working with an external editor. Remember though that when you export your images, which you can also export and then open in an external editor, you'll have other options available to you when you export.